Okay, hello everybody. This is Mitch Weisberg. I'm here for another Mind Shifting Monday with Mitch, and today we're going to be talking about the power of iteration, which is a little bit like the growth mindset, I think, in education, where we do things without the expectation that we have to succeed, and we're doing things with the hope that we're going to get information back, and so that we can continue to grow. And it's really a psychological shift. It's from looking at outcomes not as the results, but more as information. And, we all go into difficult situations with a goal, right? We want the student to sit down, or we want our child to clean their room, or we want our colleague to finally get something done on time, or our spouse to just do what we tell them to do and not to argue. Um, that those may be our long-term goals, but here's the mistake. We go into immediate action and we expect that we're going to make one move, or we're going to say one thing, or we're going to take one action, and that's then going to achieve the results. And the fragility of that result thinking is that when you expect one action to work and then it doesn't, and frankly, how often does the first thing we do end up solving the whole problem? We have nowhere to go. We feel powerless. And so what do? We escalate. Maybe we get louder. Maybe we threaten, or maybe we give up, or maybe we blame somebody. On the other hand, building in resilience, or information thinking, means that, with mind shifting, it's changing your immediate expectation. Your goal remains the same, but your expectation of this specific thing that you're doing, or this specific thing that you're saying, is what information will this give me so I can make a better second move? And after the second move, it's like, and what information will this give me so I can make a better third move? I think, we've all uh, we've all done parallel parking, right? And we know that just, pulling next to the car, changing the steering wheel, backing up, our first turn isn't meant to put us there perfectly. It's meant to give us enough room so that in the next turn or two, uh, we'll be able to park. So we turn the wheel, we back up. We know we've gone far enough when we hit the car behind us. We turn the wheel again, we move forward. We know we've gone forward enough when we hit that car in front of us, and we keep on going back and forth, hitting the two cars until, well, maybe not hitting the two cars, but getting close to the two cars until we observe the curve, and we no longer have to adjust because we're parallel. When I was preparing for today, I was also looking at some of the ways that people who have been through the resiliency course, have what the situations that they faced, and so I pulled a couple of them. Like, we what do you do when you have to support a student who frequently shuts down a difficult task? Now, here's something where the same student, you try something, they still shut down. Next time there's a difficult task, you try it again, they shut down, and you continue to get frustrated when you're in that result mindset. Or an educator dealing with upset families. You finish your semester, or you finish the school year, and of course some parents are going to be upset because their child didn't get the grades that they expected. And you go in and talking to those parents with a result mindset, you're just going to get more and more frustrated as they raise their objections, and then you raise the objections to their objections, and you go into a blame mode. And so I'm curious, for those of you who are listening or watching, in your own life right now, maybe it's with a student, or a child, or a colleague, or somebody who reports to you, or your boss. Where have you been trying to win in one move? And where have you been finding that you're hitting a brick wall? And maybe we can get a few comments here of the types of situations that you're faced with. And while you're doing that, I'll spend a little bit of time also just going through the examples from other people in the course. A spouse who took the flexible mindsets course, their partner was trying to resolve an ongoing conflict with a coworker, and they would kept they it just kept on getting more and more frustrating. But um, but using kind of an iterative approach, they were able, instead of the static attempts to fix the issue that failed, they helped their partner step back, reevaluate the situation, view past failures as useful data rather than the dead ends, come up with a few different things that they could try, and this shifted the partner's complete mindset from defeated to something proactive, knowing that there were a few different things that they could try. And then there's another one that I thought was really interesting. A person coached their spouse on how to iterate with because they had a resistant colleague that every time they raised an idea, this colleague would oppose the ideas. And so by coming up with different questions that they could ask the person and anticipating counter arguments in advance, they were able to shift from feeling reactive to being prepared for the other person to resist with something that they could respond with. And this mental rehearsal built the confidence of the spouse to remain calm and successfully navigate their colleagues' predictable opposition. So those are a few examples of how this might play out. And then when we look at kind of normal mode versus iterative mode, let's talk about a couple, say, other scenarios. Say a classroom or parenting scenario. Uh, Look at what we might normally do. A student or a child is refusing to do their work, so we walk over and say, "You need to pick up your pencil or your pen and just start to work." And we expect that we're going to say that, and the child is going to do that. But then the student puts their head down, and if we're expecting that what we say is going to work, that becomes a frustrating situation, right? But if we were approaching that in iterative mode, then hey, we've been through this before. We know that this child isn't going to be reacting the way we want to the first time we say something. We understand that the student is not going to immediately comply, but we've practiced in advance, or we've encountered this before. So maybe we say something, maybe we still start off with, "You need to pick up your pencil and start," but we're prepared for some resistance and we're ready to observe the reaction. And based on their reaction, we've prepared a few different responses, and we're going to observe what they do, and come up with other responses depending on how they react to each one. So in an iterative mode, we don't get flustered or upset when the student puts their head down. We're ready with the next question. And when the student does put their head down, instead of our brain screaming, "This child's defying me," in iterative mode, our brain says, "That's interesting data. They didn't yell, they withdrew. So my move is," and we have our next statement already. So in this iterative mode, we're experimenting and probing. We aren't in a power struggle. We're in a problem solving loop. And then here's another example. Okay, a workplace example. So we tell a colleague, what you're doing isn't working. You need to do the work this way. And we expect what that they're going to that they're going to comply. And I see there's a comment from David here, convincing older parents to consolidate all of their wishes, financial data, vendor accounts, et cetera, to make it easier when they can't make the decisions, especially when the conversation pushes them to a defensive posture. And yeah, that's another one where, in all likelihood, whatever we do the first time is not going to land. And if we're expecting it to land, when it doesn't, we get upset. But if we're walking into the situation knowing that we're going to say this, somehow or other they're going to say something that we don't expect, but we're going to take that and we're going to use that for the next thing that we say to them, maybe in the next meeting. It changes us from a mindset of getting frustrated to one where we're prepared to iterate. So let's go back to the work mode where we say to the colleague, what you're doing isn't working. You need to do it this way. Well, we know that human beings naturally resent being told what to do. So if we're walking in to get information start, maybe uh, maybe we change with a question like or a suggestion like, I'm trying to streamline our Friday meetings. Um, when you look at these reports, what's the most frustrating part for you? And so we're asking questions to establish a connection with the other person, expecting that they're going to say something, and whatever they say or do, we're going to use that to proceed. So again, the in the information goal, we're probing to see where the resistance lies instead of immediately telling somebody what to do. And then uh, the iterative method uh, comes out especially in competitive situations such as sports or um, or the methodology that I use was from an Air Force pilot, um, and you know um, that when you're in a jet and you're fighting another jet, it's called a dogfight. So in normal mode, a pilot thinks, I'm going to pull a hard left, and then they commit 100% to doing the hard left, but then the enemy banks right, and so now the pilot is flying blind because he turned left, the other person turned right. He doesn't see where the other person is. The other person now approaches him from behind, and it's a kill. In an iterative mode, the pilot might make a slight move to the left just to see how the enemy reacts. And then, based on the reaction they observe, they're ready to go with their next move, which might be a move up or a move down or speeding up or slowing down. So the first move wasn't a win. The first move was like a question. And the irony is going in expecting a quick win actually ends up resulting in more losses. So then the question is like, how do we do that? How do we go into this iterative mode as our way of dealing with situations and especially competitive situations or potential conflicts? And I use a methodology that was developed again by an Air Force pilot. And you look at those as the first thing that happens is we observe the reaction without judgment. Then we orient ourselves by coming up with different reasons why that happened and what we could do about it. Then we decide which one we're going to try out. Then we act on it, and then we loop back to see if that worked. So you think about it, we observed, and then we oriented ourselves, and then we decided on something, and then we acted. OOTA, observe, orient, decide, act. And that's the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. And really, the most important part of that is that second step, which is the orient step. The orient step is where we're coming up with options. We're taking a look at what we observe. We're digesting what we already know. We're trying to come up with things that we could do and the reasons why those might work or might not work, and then and what we think is going to happen when we try them. And one of the interesting aspects of the orient step is that data has shown that whenever we're making decisions and we have at least three options that we're considering, there's a 70% improvement in the quality of the decisions that we reach. Just think about that. By coming up with three options, there's a 70% improvement in decision making. So as we prep for different things, like let's say we're about to talk to a child about something, we're about to talk to a colleague, we're about to talk to our spouse, we're about to talk to our boss. As we prep for an event, we should be thinking about what are three things that might happen and how would I want to react. Um, and that's going to improve our decision making by at least 70%. Now, this method for coming up with decisions and then iterating towards success was devised, I mentioned, by an Air Force pilot. His name was John Boyd, and and he taught in the Air Force Academy, kind of a Top Gun. Uh, and people when he would be teaching the pilots, they would come back to him and they would say, like, you don't know what you're talking about. We're in these dogfights and we have a tenth of a second to make a decision. We can't bother with this observe, orient, decide, and act. That's just going to take a lot too much time. And so he made a bet, and this is, even going back to the 1960s, he would slap down on his desk $100 bill, and he would say, "Okay, we're going to have a dogfight, and we're going to start off, and I'm going to be in front of you, so you're going to have the dominant position, and in 40 seconds, I will have a kill." And then we're going to switch. I'm going to be behind you. You're going to be in front of me, and still within 40 seconds, I'm gonna have a kill. And if I don't win both of those, you get to keep the $100. And if you win, you owe me $100. And in 10 years, he never lost. And he's going up against, air pilots who are much younger than him, who are already kind of the best of the best, and he's beating every single one of them. And so, I see Steve Isaacs is here. Steve, welcome. Thanks for joining. So, so why was he able to win so much? Well, he would stay in information mode while his opponents were stuck in results mode. By the time they tried to fix their first move, he would do a little bit to the left, and they would overcommit to the left, and then he would slow down and loop behind them. He would go a little bit to the right. They would overcommit to the right. By the time they were on their second move, he was already on his third or fourth. He didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he reset the situation faster than his opponent could react. When you iterate with your child, or you iterate with your boss, or you iterate with your spouse, and you're able to stay one step ahead of them in any conflict, you're not fighting them, you're out learning them. And that's the key of iteration, is to outlearn and and more quickly react than the other person. So, I mentioned that having three options improves success by 70%. Why is that, you might wonder? So, when we have just one path, basically we're acting from habit. We're doing something without thinking. And so that's basically our survival mind. We haven't really thought about the situation. It could be that we come up with a rationale why that's the best, but generally speaking, that means that our prefrontal cortex, our ability to think rationally, its job is to rationalize what our emotional system has or survival brain has already come up with. When we have two options that we're considering, generally those two options are just opposite. One of the ways our survival brains work is that they're binary. They come up with an option and a second or bad one to contrast with the good one. And so when we're looking at two options, we're still operating from within our survival brain. But when we're forced to come up or we force ourselves to come up with three or more options, that's where we start to innovate. And that's where we're mind shifting. And that's where that 70% improvement happens. Because as soon as we start considering a third option, we're stepping out of our survival or binary brain, and we're stepping into tapping into our prefrontal cortex, or our resourceful brain, or our sage brain. So let's maybe practice orienting right now. If a student says, "I'm not doing this," let's maybe as a group, we can come up with some possible statements or questions to draw the student out and eventually resolve the situation. So a student says, "I'm not doing this." What are some things that what are like at least three, maybe five different things that we could say to that student that might get different reactions? Because again, if we can come up with three or four or five, then we're going to cycle through those faster than the student's going to be able to react. So it could be that we respond with what would make this more fun, or we could react with, what do you think will happen if we don't do this? Or we could respond with, what's the result you want to achieve by not doing it? Or we could respond with, well, what's something that you might get, that you might try, that's different? Or we might respond with, if that weren't available, what else could you do? And so there's like four or five things. If we went into that conversation with a student who wasn't doing something, um, and we had six statements or five statements that we knew we could respond to them, we have a much better chance of getting that student to go along with what we think that they should be doing, rather than if we go in expecting the first thing that we say is going to work. So you see why that's much more effective than blurting out instructions expecting that to work. Then there's a question, well, so if this sounds relatively easy, just go into the expectation that we're going to observe, we're going to come up with alternatives or orient, we're going to decide on one of them, we're going to act, and we're going to observe again. What are some of the mistakes that we can make in this decision making? So Boyd noted that there's really four most likely mistakes. This is John Boyd. Is that the first mistake that we make is skipping immediately to act. Something happens and we act. We react emotionally, or what you might call a knee-jerk reaction. And we naturally do this because that's the way our survival brain works. Oh, there's a problem. I have to do something right away. This is what I'm going to do. And then I do it and I justified it. That feels safe. And we have to resist the urge to immediately act, to take a step back and make some type of a pause. And then the second common mistake is a one option trap, where we come up with something that we should do and we plan based on that one thing. And we do this again because our brains are quick, they're trying to survive, and thinking is a lot of work and takes time. So unless we spur them on, our brains stop at the first answer that feels right. And so getting out of that trap is to say, look, I want to come up with three alternatives before I decide on one. And then there's the analysis trap. In the analysis trap, that's where we're waiting for the perfect solution to come. Well, you know something? This is real life. Most times, there is no perfect solution. Movement creates data. We overanalyze to try to be safe because we're afraid of doing something wrong. But in iterative mode, we're not trying to be right or wrong. We're trying to get some more information. And this just it really interesting, at least to me, a really interesting story about a district superintendent. So I was at a conference, and I was friendly with this woman who's the superintendent of a small city in Finland, and this happened to be um, that the city that was voted the happiest city in Finland. And Finland is voted one of the two happiest countries in the world, and it's one of the best education systems in the world. And she was describing all the initiatives that she took in her district, and finally, one of the U.S. districts, asked her a question that said, "Excuse me, you're talking about all these things that succeeded, but surely not everything succeeded. Tell us about something that failed." And when that question was asked, she just froze for a minute. And it seemed like it was a minute or two. It's probably only about 5 or 10 seconds. But after that 5 or 10 seconds, she just kind of slowly looked up and she says, you know, we do things in order to get information. So we're not expecting that we're going to do something and it's going to dramatically improve student behavior or improve test scores or improve engagement. We're doing things to get information so that we can use that information to come up with the next thing that we're going to do. And she says, every time we've tried something, we've gotten information and then we've been able to use that information to come up with the next thing. So I don't think that we've ever done anything that's failed. And that's really the crux of this iteration mindset. So Anyhow, that's the third major mistake is to overanalyze and think about the situation because you have to get it perfect before you try something. Well, no, if all you're doing is trying to get information, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be something. And then the fourth error is the echo chamber, and that's only talking to people who disagree, who agree with you. We're all social animals, right? So we're driven to be around people who agree with us and who are just like us. And effectiveness can sometimes feel uncomfortable. We very often we go into conflict with people and it becomes constructive conflict because it leads to something to results that are more effective than if either party could have devised on their own. And so making sure that we're not in an echo chamber, making sure that there's a diversity of thought, a diversity of experiences in a decision is something that's really important. And I think one of the examples that's used all the time is when JFK was president. He approached the CIA and the army, and they basically chimed in that all we need is to organize these Cuban refugees in Florida. They're going to land in Cuba, and all the Cubans are going to take up arms and they're going to overthrow Castro. And that was a fiasco. But in those decisions that he was talking, everybody already agreed. And so what he implemented after that was that he made sure that there was at least one or two people in any decision that was going to disagree. And when it came time, I guess about 6 or 8 months later, where the Soviet Union, which is kind of which became Russia, but the Soviet Union was going to establish nuclear arms in Cuba because he had all these different viewpoints. They were able to come up with a whole raft of different actions, really consider the ramifications of each one, and he was able to stop the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you can read about both of these decisions if you read the book, All the President's Men. And so those are the four errors that we make, even if we try to be iterative. One is skipping directly to act. Two is only having one option that we're considering. Third is over analysis and paralysis by analysis. And fourth, having an echo chamber. So maybe for those of you who are listening, maybe you can think of a plan you have for this week, something that you want to accomplish. Who is the one person in your life most likely to disagree with that plan? And what is one question that you could ask them to find the blind spot in your decision making? And for me, it's really not that hard. I surround I'm talking to people all the time who disagree with me. Most people actually disagree with me, so it's not very hard for me to find people who are willing to put a fly in my ointment and make me reconsider things that I would normally do. But on the other hand, even though what comes out is different from what I had originally intended, generally what results is something that's much better than I would have done myself. So maybe you could look for that in your lives. So just summarizing where we are, we need to stop expecting our first move to be the final move. So have to go into situations today looking for information and the results that will follow. We have to go into situations expecting that we're going to be observing, orienting, which is coming up with possible actions, deciding in which one to do, acting, and then going back, looking at the results, and then observing, orienting, deciding, and acting again, looping through those until the situation is resolved. The fact is that the person who can loop through the most different options the fastest, that's the one who's probably going to have the most alternatives ready. And that's the person who's most likely going to prevail in any situation like a conflict or a competition. And this has really just scratched the surface to being resilient. When John Boyd coached people through what he called, the OODA loop, his sessions were between 1 day and 3 days. We teach this in the resiliency course, and there's a course starting on April 14th, and you see the QR code up there. So if you want to really dive into how you can learn how to uh, be resilient, um, resilient mindsets for long-term success, how you could prepare your students or your family members or your colleagues to be resilient, consider taking the course that starts April 14th, and I hope to see you there. And and I hope to see you next Monday, um, where we're going to be talking about other aspects of mindset shifting, and and actually see you everybody. So this is Mitch Weisberg for Mind Shifting Monday with Mitch. I'm signing off, and hope to see you all next week.